and talk about Chapter 7, and we'll discuss the bones. We'll talk about some cool stuff. Okay, so let me pull this up right here for you. Bam. All right, so Chapter 7, we're talking about the skeletal system. Like I was saying before, our bones are part of our connective tissue, the supporting connective tissue. And there's two types, but we'll discuss that in a moment. So when we're discussing the skeletal system, not only are we going to be discussing the actual bones of the skeleton, but you'll notice we have other tissues and structures that we're going to be talking about. Cartilage, all right? And we know of the three different types of cartilage, but mostly we'll be focusing on fibrocartilage and the hyaline cartilage. Then we have ligaments. Those are the tissues that attach the bones to one another. And there's going to be some other connective tissue that we'll discuss, and we'll get into that later on throughout this chapter review. All right. I mean, ligaments too are another tissue, but they'll attach muscles to bones. So this is an important statement here, and I really want you to kind of put this into your brain. The bones are the actual organs of the skeletal system. Okay. So when you're thinking of your femur, for example, the bone in your thigh, the largest, strongest bone in your body, that's an organ, like your liver, like your spleen, like your stomach. That is an organ, okay? But these organs are going to be very stiff, relatively inflexible, right? They'll provide the structural framework to our body. It's going to offer protection. We'll talk about all these different functions here in a moment. But let's discuss some of the other tissues that we're going to see. Another tissue is cartilage. Again, another supporting connective tissue, right? But with cartilage, all right, we're going to see a tissue that's not going to be as rigid as bone. It's going to have a little bit more flexibility. We'll talk about why it has that. All right, so the two types, as I mentioned before, are going to be the hyaline cartilage and the fibrocartilage. Hyaline cartilage, we discussed how when you're developing as a fetus into a baby, you take on that human form, you're going to develop a skeleton. Well, it starts off as a hyaline cartilage skeleton, and then it gets replaced with bone. But we'll see hyaline cartilage in several other places. In our growth plates during our adolescent years, that's going to allow that lengthening of the bone. We'll also see it covering the ends of your long bones in joint spaces, and they offer shock absorption, protective functions, reduce friction in there. All right, often you'll hear people complain about how they don't have any cartilage left in their joint, and they're usually referring to hyaline cartilage or the fibrocartilage if they're talking about their knees. All right, and speaking of fibrocartilage, that's our weight-bearing cartilage. We see it in the vertebral spine. It's the discs in the spine. We'll also see it in our knees. Again, it's going to act as a shock absorber to help withstand some of the compression that the knees undergo. And then, of course, we have some of our other tissues here, the ligaments, which is a dense regular connective tissue, which is going to connect bone to bone. And then our tendons, which is another dense regular connective tissue, which is going to connect muscle to bone. So here's a nice picture here in which you can see, all right, we'll zoom in a little bit. The blue represents the hyaline cartilage. So you can see hyaline cartilage is scattered all over the place, but you can see it's lining the ends of these long bones here in joint spaces. We'll also see it here along the costal cartilage where the ribs attach onto your sternum. Right, then you can see that looks pink to me, all right, pinkish purple. All right, that's where the fibrocartilage is. And you can see the fibrocartilage is pretty much in the middle of your body, in the spine here, and those are the intervertebral discs, down here in the pubic symphysis, where both your hip bones come and articulate with one another, and then down here in your knees, wonderful shock absorbers. They do a great job in protection there. So some of the basic functions here for bones, all right, support and protection. Makes sense, right? Because we have a rigid structural framework to our body, so it's going to support that framework. And also, all right, we'll see it act as a protection covering to certain structures, brain and spinal cord, for example, the skull, all right, covers the brain, protects the brain. Okay, the vertebral column covers and surrounds your spinal cord, protects the spinal cord. All right, we'll also see in the rib cage too, how the ribs will help to protect the heart, lungs, the other tissues there in your thorax. Our muscles attach onto the bones. And the purpose for muscles is to move things. But so what are they moving? They're moving the bones because they will attach onto the bones, and therefore the bones will act as levers for movement. Now, if you've taken a physics course, right, or if you read the complete chapter for chapter 8, it discusses the different classifications of levers if that's what you're interested in. All right, but I'm not going to get into that in this review here because there's several other things that I want to get to. But understand that this lever movement allows for us to what you're probably demonstrating right now as you're taking notes. We're seeing that lever movement action, in action. This process here, hemopoiesis. This process is the actual formation of your blood formed elements. And that doesn't just include your red blood cells. That includes the white blood cells, the leukocytes, and also your platelets. Okay, so pretty much the blood formed elements are all going to be created in the bone marrow. And in fact, it's specifically the red bone marrow, because you do have yellow bone marrow, and that's going to be an inactive form of bone marrow. All right, and so it's going to be made mostly of fat. And then another function for the bones is going to be the storage for mineral and energy reserves, which is interesting, okay? Because when we talk about storage of certain minerals, yes, calcium is part of that. Magnesium is also part of that, all right? Phosphate. These are going to be molecules that are quite important in several different types of physiological processes in your body. Magnesium especially, it's underappreciated. And not that I'm going to be sitting here and pushing on you folks the importance of supplementation, but one of the supplements, if you're going to take vitamins and whatnot, or individual supplements, I always encourage people to take magnesium. Magnesium is used in over 600 chemical processes in your body, and it actually is crucial in the formation of energy in your cells, specifically ATP, which leads me into this fella, phosphate. That's why, okay, your bone, it will store phosphate because it helps to make up the structural framework of the bone, but also we need phosphate in the formation of adenosine triphosphate. All right, so that's why we say that the function for bone is going to be for storage of mineral and energy reserves, and we're talking about the phosphate molecule for that. So let's talk a little bit about anatomy of our bone. All right, so when we're talking about a long bone, there's a couple different types of bones, but we're talking about a long bone. All right, there's a couple different regions here, and I'm going to draw a horrible kind of model here. All right, here's our long bone. All right, so this middle of it here, the shaft of our long bone is called the diaphysis. All right, and so this is where we're going to see, all right, our compact bone is going to make out the outer lining of the diaphysis. We're just inside of the compact bone, we'll see the spongy bone. And within the spongy bone, that's where we'll see our bone marrow. So think of it pretty much, the compact bone is on the outside of the bone, and the spongy bone will be just inside the compact bone. Well, another name for the shaft of the bone, and this is the term that you should be using, is the diaphysis. Then in mature bones, okay, and most of us, the adults, there'll be a cavity inside, a nice hollow cavity. We call that the medullary cavity. That's found within, all right, the diaphysis of the bone. Now in adults, okay, for the most part, that cavity is going to have the yellow bone marrow. And I was telling you about that before. The yellow bone marrow is the inactive bone marrow. All right, but in children, that cavity will contain red bone marrow. Red bone marrow is the active bone marrow. It'll be making those formed blood element cells, okay, undergoing the process of hemopoiesis. Then going back to our awesomely drawn model here, okay, for our long bone. You'll notice on either end of our bone, our long bone, there are these knobs that you can see. All right, those knobs are called the epiphysis, and there's two. All right, the one that's closest to your trunk, okay, that's going to be the proximal epiphysis, and the one that's furthest away from the trunk is going to be the distal epiphysis. All right, so same thing holds true for the epiphysis. The outer portion of the epiphysis is going to be made up of compact bone, and just internal to that, or the inner part, okay, is going to be made up of spongy bone. Compact on the outside, spongy on the inside. And then on the ends of these long bones, this is where we're going to take a nice layer of hyaline cartilage and put it on the ends of these long bones, because in most cases, these long bones are going to be articulating, that means connecting to another bone and making up your joints. So that hyaline cartilage helps to greatly reduce friction, and it acts as a shock absorber. Very, very helpful. Helps to prolong the life of those bones, okay, because you're stuck with them. All right, two other structures here on our long bone. All right, we're going to see the metaphysis, and basically the metaphysis is this area here, where the epiphysis starts to taper down into the diaphysis. So it's that region there, okay, metaphysis, where we move from the epiphysis into the diaphysis, or vice versa. You can say you're moving from the diaphysis into the epiphysis, but we see where it starts to narrow down. Now, it contains a very important structure. It's called the epiphyseal growth plate. All right, this here is going to be present, all right, in younger people. Now, once you reach skeletal maturity, when you're done growing per se, all right, then it seals off and it turns completely into bone. But during your growth period, all right, in the epiphyseal growth plate, that's where you're going to see your hyaline cartilage. And we're going to discuss that process in which the hyaline cartilage, it starts to produce cartilage, and then the cartilage dies, and then it gets replaced by bone. And that's how you actually will see a lengthwise growth of bone. But that's where it occurs, in the metaphysis, but specifically at the epiphyseal plate there. And then when you're done growing and all the cartilage is gone, then you'll see this line on the outside of the bone, and we refer to that as the epiphyseal line. And that's where essentially where the growth plate has kind of sealed itself off. All right, so just to kind of zoom in here, we're going to look at a nice mature skeletal bone here. All right, so you can see the shaft of the bone. There's the diaphysis, and you can see it, the medullary cavity, right, quite hollow. So we'll see some blood vessels in there. And then if we go up here to the proximal epiphysis, all right, you'll see here we'll still have some blood vessels there. All right, but you can see this is where the epiphyseal line is. Again, this is a mature bone, so there's no cartilage here. There's no growth plate. And here where it starts to taper down, that is known as the metaphysis. And so we're going to talk about all the fun stuff here. You can see the compact bone is on the outside. Here it's pretty solid and thick. And then you can see the spongy bone, and it really looks like a sponge. Okay, you'll have these spaces in there. All right, so let's talk about some of the parts of the bone here. So we'll start with the outside of our bone, all right, or the covering there, the periosteum. We discussed this briefly when we were going over tissues in chapter 5. And we discussed how the periosteum is made up of, and this is important that you know, all right, dense irregular connective tissue. And so as we know, dense irregular connective tissue is quite strong. It's tough. So this periosteum provides us with this tough covering to the surface of our bone, which is wonderful, because this tough covering is going to allow things to attach onto the bone and not damage the bone, right? So we'll see here, we'll see blood vessels anchored to that area. We'll see nerves going into that area. We'll also see ligaments and tendons attaching onto the periosteum, which is great because it is a tough, dense, irregular connective tissue. Well, there's two layers to it for our periosteum. The outer layer is the dense irregular connective tissue. And the inner layer, all right, we call the intercellular layer. And we call it the intercellular layer because you have these 3 cell lines existed there. And we'll talk about what those cells do in a little bit. All right, but for right now, we've got our osteoprogenitor cells, our osteoblasts, and our osteoclasts. Some of those cells will build bone tissue, and some of those cells will tear down the bone tissue. Okay. And then we'll also see our perforating fibers in the periosteum, and that's what holds the periosteum onto the actual compact bone. All right, so these perforating fibers are essentially just collagen fibers. And as you know, collagen fibers are a protein fiber that are very, very strong. So these perforating fibers attach the periosteum onto, all right, the surface of the bone, also known as Sharpie's fibers. So here you can see our periosteum. All right, so you can see we have our outer dense irregular connective tissue layer, the fibrous layer. This is the layer that everything gets attached onto. And then just inside of it, all right, we have our intercellular layer. And you can see there's a bunch of different cell types here. And then what attaches the periosteum onto the compact bone here are these collagen fibers called perforating fibers or Sharpie's fibers. And then also you can see here, all right, there's our osteocyte friend. Okay, our osteocytes that live in the lacuna, all right, these chambers or spaces here. So they reside in there. And so they help to maintain the bone matrix. Oh, I'm excited to tell you all about the bone matrix, trust me. So something you should realize is that our bones, as you know, are organs. And so organs need to have a blood supply, hopefully, and they need to have a nervous supply. So bones, believe it or not, are highly vascularized. And so there are lots of blood vessels that wander throughout the bone. Okay, so they enter in from the external outside of the bone, they enter in through the periosteum. And there's a hole there, usually in the diaphysis, right in the center, all right, of the diaphysis, and it enters through this hole called the nutrient foramen. And this is where arteries will enter into the bone and where the veins will leave the bone. All right. Also, we'll see nerves which will accompany, all right, the arteries and veins. And they'll do the same thing. They'll enter into the nutrient foramen there. So keep in mind, your bone is highly vascularized and it is going to have a decent level of innervation. And when we say innervation, we're talking about nerves that go to the bone. Okay, so we'll talk about all these structures, but those nerves are going to actually affect your bone, your periosteum, the endosteum, which is the inner portion of your bone that lines the marrow cavity. So pretty much those nerves are sensory nerves. So they'll monitor like added stresses to the bone, if there's damage to the bone. And so then that will send sensory information to your control center, AKA the central nervous system. And then the central nervous system can enact certain processes that are going to handle whatever the stimulus was. All right. So let's talk about our bone's microscopic anatomy. All right. So this is where we're going to get into the cells. So keep in mind, quick review, bone is a connective tissue. Second type of connective tissue are supporting connective tissue. But keep in mind, as you recall, connective tissue is made up of two things, cells and the extracellular matrix. And the extracellular matrix gets broken down into protein fibers and ground substance. So let's start off here first with the cells. And so there's 4 types of cells. And you heard me mention all of these within the past few moments. We have our osteoprogenitor cells, the osteoblasts, osteocytes, and the osteoclasts. And remember what I said, all right? Some of those cells are going to build bone, and some of those cells are going to tear down the bone. So let's start off with the osteoprogenitor cells. These are stem cells. Okay, so by now I'm hoping that you kind of understand what stem cells do. All right, they come from that mesenchyme, as do most of our connective tissue come from mesenchyme. And so what will happen is the osteoprogenitor cells, right, they'll divide. And so we get where we had one cell, we now have two cells, and we call those daughter cells. Well, one of those daughter cells will remain an osteoprogenitor cell to divide again. The other one becomes what we call a committed cell. And that committed cell, once it grows up, will become an osteoblast. And we're going to talk about what an osteoblast does here in a moment. All right, more on that in a moment. So where do we find these osteoprogenitor cells? One, we find them in the periosteum, which is that outer covering, right, to the bone. And then also we find it in the endosteum, which is the inner lining to the medullary cavity and the spongy bone. Look, I should have shown you this before. Let me just quickly go back here and see if I have. All right, it's tough to see. Let me zoom in here in case you're wondering, well, what the heck is the endosteum, Dr. Kaz? Okay, if you look here, you can see the endosteum is this inner lining here. So the periosteum is on the outside and the endosteum is on the inside. It lines the inside, all right, of the medullary cavity here. And so it's going to have a cell layer also, and that cell layer will contain, all right, these cells that we just saw here, all right, in our periosteum. All right, so the osteoblasts. So the osteoblasts have a big role, and here's their role. Their job is to synthesize, that means make and secrete osteoid. Osteoid is going to be the organic form of our bone matrix, okay? So it's this semi-solid, similar in consistency to cartilage, okay, initially. Okay, so think of it as like cement, wet cement. That's what osteoid is. So these cells will produce the organic osteoid, which is made up of, okay, that's the extracellular matrix. So the osteoid is going to contain protein fibers and our ground substance. Okay, we'll talk about that later on. So think of it as wet cement that's starting to dry. And what will happen is, all right, when it dries, we're going to refer to that drying, quote unquote, as calcify. And all that means is, like wet cement, it hardens. All right, but there's a process that occurs for that hardening, which we'll talk about. And so what will happen is during this process, these cells make the osteoid and they secrete it all around themselves. All right, and so as they're doing that, and the osteoid starts to harden or calcify, they become trapped in the matrix. And then when that occurs, they turn into osteocytes. And so their job is to maintain the bone matrix. So going back to this picture here, that's these fellas. All right, these guys are osteocytes. At one point, right, they were normal osteoblasts. And so they were producing all of this stuff out here, okay? And so it was that nice wet cement, okay? And then it underwent the process of calcification and it hardened and they got stuck there. And now they're trapped within that matrix, which is fine by them because then they convert themselves over into osteocytes and then they just maintain the bone matrix. That's their new life, all right? So that's what these guys are. They're the mature bone cells, the osteocytes, that came from osteoblasts. And so their job is to maintain the bone matrix. So they'll see if there's any type of damage, let's say, to the bone, if we've increased the amount of stress on bone or decreased the amount of stress on bone, like if you gain weight, all right, or like if you're out running, let's say, that's going to increase more stress onto the bone. And when that happens, they'll start to trigger new bone formation. So your bones could withstand that new stress. Okay, the next type of bone cell is going to be our osteoclasts. The osteoclasts are cool. All right, first of all, they're a relatively large cell. They're going to have more than one nucleus, so multinuclear, and they do one of my favorite processes, they're phagocytic. So they're the Pac-Man cell. They go around and gobble things up. So it's really kind of neat because what happened was a bunch of these cells, all right, these bone marrow cells fused together to form this superpowered osteoclast cell. It's like Voltron. If you've ever seen Voltron, these little robots that come together to form one big robot. Oh, that's what happened here. Okay. So these osteoclasts are now these large fused cell, and it goes around and it gobbles things up. And so it has this structure on it, which we call the ruffled border. So I'll try to draw you a picture of it. So it looks like this, and then it has these little kind of things at the bottom here. And that's called the ruffled border. And that ruffled border contains, all right, these what we call proteolytic enzymes. And so these enzymes will essentially, it's almost like acid, and it will start to break down the bone. And so what we call that process is bone resorption. So it will create these pits, all right, these depression pits on the bone surface, in which we refer to them as resorption lacuna, because your bones are constantly remodeling themselves depending on what type of life you live. If you're growing up, all right, your bones need to get stronger as you add weight to your skeleton, right? If you go out into space, right, and you're weightless, all right, that's going to change the stresses on your skeleton, okay? But when you come back to Earth, if you're a person that runs a lot, that constant pounding on the road is going to cause stress to the skeleton. So your skeleton needs to remodel itself. So the osteoclasts will help with that. So they'll start with the remodeling portion. All right, so we now know the 4 types of bone cells that are present in bone. And so we know that some of them are going to create the bone matrix. So now we're going to talk about what the heck the bone matrix is. All right, so there's 2 parts to it. You have an organic component and an inorganic component. So we'll start off with the organic component because it's just a little bit more complicated. The organic component, we talked about this before, is the osteoid. So who makes that? Our osteoblast. Easy to remember. Osteoblast contains B. And so think of this cell, B blast, build bone. So osteoblasts build bone. So they're going to create the extracellular matrix, or osteoid, which is going to contain high amounts of collagen. That's going to make the matrix strong. But also, okay, it's going to produce the other part of the extracellular matrix, the ground substance. Okay, and that's going to be proteoglycans and glycoproteins. All right, so it's the ground substance and the collagen, which is like the wet cement. So this organic component is going to give bone its tensile strength. This part is really important because you can see on a test question where it says, what happens if your bone cannot produce osteoid? Okay, if collagen production decreases, all right, what could happen? Well, if we're not producing as much of the osteoid as we used to, all right, our bones become brittle because you're still going to have the hardening portion of it. So it's the organic component that's going to resist the stretching of bone. It gives the bone what we call the tensile strength, which is essentially the flexibility that bones have. And believe you me, they don't have a lot of flexibility, but they have some. They do. Okay, and you should be thankful for that, because if they didn't have any flexibility, all right, our bones would snap a little bit easier. If you've ever seen the movie Unbreakable with Bruce Willis and Samuel L. Jackson Jackson's character has this condition called osteogenesis imperfecta, aka brittle bone disease. And his problem is that he is not producing the organic components to the bone. So his bones are brittle and they break quite easily. because they don't have that flexibility. So the inorganic component to our bones, this is, I often call it the bone salts. Okay, but the inorganic component is going to contain, all right, these salt crystals, which are predominantly going to be our calcium phosphates. So that's why you can see that when I said that one of the functions of bone is a storage facility, all right, well, it stores calcium and it stores phosphate in there for a later time. All right, so calcium phosphate is going to interact with another molecule called calcium hydroxide. The important thing is, right, what we're going to see with this interaction is we're going to form these crystals called hydroxyapatite. And it's this right here, whoop, right there. That structure, all right, the hydroxyapatite, this is going to create, all right, the hard portion, the hardened matrix. Because what we'll see is the osteoid has been produced, our wet cement is ready, now it needs to dry. Okay, so what will make it dry? The bone salts. Okay, this hydroxyapatite, all right, along with a couple of other items will come along, and these crystals will deposit themselves around the collagen fibers throughout the ground substance there. And that process, we call it calcification, will cause a hardening of the bone matrix. And that's what's going to give our bones their rigidity, their stiffness. Okay, so the organic component gives it its flexibility, and then the inorganic component is going to give it its rigidity. So this hydroxyapatite, these salt bone crystals will just sprinkle themselves along the collagen, and in doing so, that will cause the bone matrix to harden. So let me just kind of give you a little bit of a story to that. All right, how does bone form? Well, first we start off with our osteoblasts secreting the osteoid. And then the hydroxyapatite crystals come along and they sprinkle themselves and disperse themselves along the collagen fibers in the osteoid. And what will happen is we'll start to see this precipitation of the crystals that occur, and that process is called calcification. And that causes that hardening of the bone matrix. It's that simple. So a couple of things that we need for this bone formation to occur. Vitamin D is quite important because we talked about this before in the previous chapter, chapter 6, all right, where we saw that the skin forms cholecalciferol, which is an inactive form of vitamin D, and then it goes through a couple processes in the liver and in the kidney, and it winds up as calcitriol. It's the calcitriol that enhances or increases the absorption of calcium and phosphate from your digestive tract, from the small intestine. So the vitamin D is going to increase that calcium absorption. So now you have calcium to make the hydroxyapatite. We also need vitamin C. We really didn't talk about this too much, and I won't bore you with it, but vitamin C is crucial for collagen formation. That's why when you get decreased levels of vitamin C significantly, you get scurvy. And scurvy is the collagen that your body manages to produce is not as strong. It's actually a relatively weak form of collagen. So you get bleeding gums and ulcerations and whatnot. And so vitamin C, you need that because it's crucial in the proper formation of collagen. And then, of course, we need our calcium and our phosphate, which is hugely important that you are on a decent diet so we can actually harden the matrix with the process of calcification. Okay, so now we know how to build bone, but now we need to learn how we resorb the bone because we need to remodel the bone. Sometimes something can happen, or if you're growing, or if you've gained weight a lot, all right, we need to restructure the bone to handle what's going on. All right, so that involves these guys right here. the osteoclasts, the cells that break down the bone. So what we need to do is destroy the bone matrix because we need to make a new bone matrix. So the osteoclasts release those proteolytic enzymes, all right, onto the ruffled border there. And those proteolytic enzymes come from these fellas. You guys remember the lysosomes. Those are those digestive organelles that are found within the cells there. And so all they do is basically digest the organic matrix, break down the collagen, and by doing so, all right, break down those the proteoglycans and the glycoproteins. By breaking that down, you release, okay, the calcium and phosphate, and that will be dissolved by hydrochloric acid. And so that will break down the hydroxyapatite into individual calcium and phosphate ions, which will then travel into the blood. So actually, there are hormones in your body that will facilitate this process. They will activate osteoclasts because if you get low blood calcium, which is called hypocalcemia, right, and we need to increase your calcium levels, you have hormones there that will actually facilitate the breaking down of the bone matrix there to release that calcium and that phosphate. We really just need the calcium into your blood to increase your blood calcium levels. Okay, so we talked about the bone, okay, but we can't just leave it at that. We've got to discuss, all right, the hyaline cartilage. All right, hyaline cartilage plays a role in the bone because when we're talking about the epiphyseal growth plate, you'll find it there, but you'll also find it on the ends of the long bones there. So let's talk a little bit about hyaline cartilage, and then we'll get into some of the more specifics here. So when we're talking about hyaline cartilage, same thing, we're dealing with the connective tissue, so that means we have cells and extracellular matrix. So with the hyaline cartilage, the cells will do the same thing. They're going to produce the extracellular matrix, which is made up of protein fibers and our ground substance. So the cells will be scattered all throughout the cartilage matrix there, surrounded by the protein fibers that they produce and the ground substance that they produce. And that ground substance are going to be proteoglycans, but guess what? No calcium. No calcium. Because the calcium, we're going to come back to that, is going to cause an issue with our hyaline cartilage, and we can't deal with that right now. So because of that, all right, we have a nice semi-rigid type of matrix there, which makes our hyaline cartilage flexible, more flexible than bone. And that, a lot of that has to do with because there is a large amount and presence of water in our ground substance. So that's why hyaline cartilage is wonderful for compression and for shock absorption. But you need to keep in mind, mature cartilage is avascular. Okay, so in order for it to get nutrients, it really relies on diffusion. And diffusion is crucial, all right, because without it, you wouldn't be able to get rid of wastes and then also acquire nutrients. So keep in mind also, no nervous innervation of mature hyaline cartilage. So a good way to facilitate diffusion, and this goes back to chapter 4 when we were talking about the rate of diffusion, is an increase in temperature, all right, or a difference in the concentration gradient. Well, an increase in temperature will actually be facilitated through movement. When you start to move, okay, you're going to increase the rate of diffusion because, again, you'll get some friction. What is one of the byproducts of friction? Heat. So the temperature will slightly increase in that area, which is great for the movement of molecules. How do we feel pain in the knee if there's no nerves? That's a great question, Melanie, great question. How we feel pain in the knees is, it's not from the cartilage that you're getting the pain from. You're getting the pain, all right, from the actual bone. Because once the cartilage wears away, okay, now you'll get bone grinding on bone. And what did I say about bone? Bone has a lot of nervous innervation there, predominantly sensory nerves. So as you're causing damage to that bone connective tissue, right, the sensory nerves are picking that up, and then it's sending the pain signals to your brain. And so it's not because of the cartilage, it's because where the cartilage used to be, it's no longer there. Great question. No, thank you. I love questions. Okay, so let's go over some of the players here for cartilage. Okay, when we're talking about hyaline cartilage, you're going to see, we've talked about the chondrocytes, but all right, we have a new cell here, the chondroblast. Same thing, B blast. Chondroblast is going to build the cartilage. It's going to produce the cartilage matrix. Similarly, as to the osteoblasts, remember how the osteoblasts produce the bone matrix? Well, the chondroblasts are going to produce the cartilage matrix. And the same situation happens to the chondroblasts that happened to the osteoblasts. They produce the matrix, they get stuck in the matrix, okay? They're encased in this matrix now. And then as that matrix will start to harden, right, those chondroblasts are stuck there, and then they will convert into chondrocytes. And they do the same thing as the osteocytes did. They're going to maintain the matrix there. And they even live in the same named spaces, okay, the lacuna. So we saw how there was a covering to the bone, we call that periosteum. Well, the covering to hyaline cartilage, we call that perichondrium. And so we have, all right, similarly to that we saw with periosteum, okay, the outer covering there is made up of a dense, irregular connective tissue. So that tough, fibrous connective tissue is going to help to cover the cartilage and protect it. But in this case, it also helps to maintain the shape of that cartilage. Because remember, cartilage is not going to be as rigid as bone. It's a little bit softer. So the perichondrium helps shape that cartilage. All right. So now that we know some of the players that are involved with cartilage, now we're going to talk about how cartilage grows. So there's two types of growth when we're talking about cartilage. And this all starts when you are growing inside your mommy. All right, so during that embryological development there, because remember what I said, we're going to form a skeleton, okay, but it's going to start off as cartilage. So there's two types of growth when we're talking about cartilage growth. The lengthening of the cartilage, all right, we call that interstitial growth. And so this is going to be in the internal regions on the inside of the cartilage. And the other type of growth is going to be the growth, the widthwise growth, that's appositional. And this occurs on the outside of the cartilage. So easy to remember, interstitial, inside. Okay, appositional, outside. All right, so we're going to see something similar to this when we get into the bone. So it's story time, everybody. I'm going to tell you all a story. So first of all, here we are with our sample of cartilage, of hyaline cartilage on the outside. Here's our perichondrium, our outer fibrous covering here. And then you've got a thin layer here of all these cells here, these little flat structures. Okay, those are going to be your chondroblasts. They're immature, okay? And so they're produced on the outer portion here. All right, and then they'll migrate down on the inside. But we're going to start here looking at the internal portion. Okay, this is the interstitial growth. Interstitial means internal growth. All right, so here's what's going to happen. You've got your chondrocyte, okay, that was produced, all right, it started off as a chondroblast. And then it secreted the cartilage matrix. It got stuck in the cartilage matrix. And then what happened was it converted itself into a chondrocyte. And then it just started hanging out there, maintaining the matrix nearby. Well, one day it decides, I'm gonna divide. I'm bored. I'm gonna divide. I'm living in my lacuna. It's a 1-bedroom, it's a studio apartment. And so I'm sick of it. I'm lonely. So I'm going to divide and split off. And now I produce 2 daughter cells. And so when that occurs, all right, it's automatically converted from a chondrocyte into chondroblasts. So where you had 1 chondrocyte, now you have 2 chondroblasts, but they're living in the same studio apartment. That's not going to work. They need their space. So this is what they're going to do. Each chondroblast is going to start to produce its own new cartilage matrix. And it's going to produce that cartilage matrix around itself. And so you'll start to see now how these chondroblasts are starting to push themselves away from each other as they're producing new cartilage matrix, which will push this older cartilage matrix out. And so once you have each cell pretty much having its own cartilage matrix here, and they're still almost sharing the same lacuna, the same studio apartment, all right, once they've pretty much split off completely, now they're their own individual chondrocytes. And that individual chondrocyte will keep producing that cartilage matrix until they have pushed away from each other. And now they're 2 individual cells in their individual lacuna. Now they each have their own studio apartment, and they'll continue to produce that new matrix, right, until there's signal to stop producing that matrix. And that's interstitial growth. Okay, so that's what we see on the inside here. The other type of growth is going to be appositional growth. This is going to increase the width of the cartilage. Okay, interstitial occurs on the inside, and that increases the length. But now we're going to see here on the periphery, okay, more on the outside, all right, appositional growth. So this picture here is showing you, okay, you have these mesenchymal cells, and we know that mesenchymal cells are going to be the stem cells for connective tissue. These mesenchymal cells will specifically produce chondroblasts. So they're producing these chondroblasts, and you'll see, all right, as they're doing so, the new matrix material will stay on the periphery while it'll push the older matrix material downwards, all right, or inwards, so to speak. And so by that, it's like a tree, you know, a young tree is relatively skinny, and then over years and years and years, the trunk gets thicker and thicker and thicker, okay, because it grows out there from the outer edge right underneath the tree bark there. Well, that's what we see here, similar to that. So here we can see, all right, you'll have these chondroblasts, all right, that came from the mesenchyme, and now those chondroblasts are going to do what chondroblasts do. They're going to keep producing that new that cartilage matrix there, and it pushes it out. And then what we'll see is they'll start to move down towards the internal portion here, but at the same time, they're always producing more, all right, cartilage matrix. And as it does so, it'll start to migrate, the older cells will migrate more towards the center, and that'll push out the outer periphery here. Okay, so always keep in mind that these cells, as they're producing the cartilage matrix, they're going to just be pushing other cells away from themselves, because that cartilage matrix is going to be, it's like 2 magnets, all right, that have the same pole. They repel each other, all right. Well, that cartilage matrix will push the cells away from each other. Both of those cells are producing new cartilage matrix there. All right, so now you know how cartilage grows. Now we're going to talk about how bone is going to grow, okay? Bone formation. So we call that process ossification or osteogenesis, new bone growth. And so we're going to start to see this occur, all right, again, during the embryological development. And that's going to start anywhere between the 8th and 12th week of the embryologic development, all the way through your childhood into adolescence, which is teenage years and your early 20s. So this is going on. And in some of you, it's going on right now. My time is over. I'm no longer undergoing, all right, this osteogenesis. I'm only undergoing bone remodeling. So there's two types, all right, of ossification. We have intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. So let's start off with the intramembranous. Again, it's story time, everybody. So we're going to go through each step, and then I'll show you a picture. Okay, so the first one, okay, step one, what we're going to see is you're going to have, all right, these pockets of mesenchyme. And I hope by now you know what mesenchyme is. So you're going to see within these regions of mesenchyme, right, you're going to start to see these, what we call ossification centers develop. And again, some of those cells are going to contain and be osteoprogenitor cells. And so we know what osteoprogenitor cells do. As they divide and they produce two new daughter cells, one will stay as an osteoprogenitor cell. The other one will become an osteoblast, a committed cell. And that osteoblast, we know what it does. It builds bone. How does it do that? It secretes the osteoid. So that's what we're seeing here in this picture. Step one. Okay, so you have all this mesenchyme floating around. Well, in certain areas of the mesenchyme, okay, you'll get these areas that start to thicken and these ossification centers develop. And those osteoprogenitor cells will start to create these osteoblasts. And these osteoblasts then start to secrete the osteoids. So that's what we start to see occurring here in our first step. Okay, so we start off with mesenchyme. And then in that mesenchyme, some of those cells will differentiate into osteoprogenitor cells, and then they'll produce, right, osteoblasts. So what happens to the osteoid? Well, it's going to undergo, remember, it's that wet cement, and it's going to undergo that calcification process. Okay, so what do we need for that calcification process? Okay, we need our bone salts to appear, okay, that hydroxyapatite. So we've set the wet cement up, now it just needs to dry. So those calcium bone salts will start to infiltrate the area, and it'll be sprinkled along the osteoid. And when that occurs, we start to get, all right, the hardening of that matrix. And guess what? Now those osteoblasts become trapped in the bone matrix. It's nice and hard, and they convert into osteocytes. And that's what we see here. Okay, so now the bone matrix has started to harden. All right, calcium has infiltrated the area, and now those cells that get trapped turn into osteocytes. But you can see these cells on the periphery, they're going to keep building more bone matrix. Okay, and then what will happen is some of these cells will get trapped, all right, once the bone matrix hardens from the calcium that gets into the area, and they'll convert into osteocytes. All right, that leads us to step 3 here. So now that process is going to just continue on and continue on into large scale, and we're going to start to form the early version of bone, and we call that woven bone. And all right, woven bone is an immature bone, okay? And we say it's immature because it's poorly organized. We're not going to have, all right, that nice orderly formation of the bone tissue occurring. And so keep in mind, all right, as this woven bone occurs, all right, on the inside, the outside, we are going to start to develop the periosteum, because as you know, periosteum covers our bone tissue. So the mesenchyme that surrounds the woven bone will start to convert into our periosteum. And that's what we're seeing over here. You can see now we have our woven bone. We'll start to develop these small spaces in there, and blood vessels will start to infiltrate. But on the outside here, okay, the mesenchyme will start to convert itself into the periosteum. All right, that nice bone covering. And then our last step is that woven bone is going to start to convert into what we call lamellar bone, all right, which is secondary bone. It's going to be a little bit stronger, more mature, okay? And so remember, when we're talking about bones, we've got compact bone and spongy bone. The outer portion of the bone will be compact, and then just internal to that, we'll have the spongy bone. And we call it spongy bone because there's spaces in the bone. And so we call these, it's like a scaffolding type of structure. We call that the trabeculae that is found within the spongy bone. So when we're looking at, you should be learning that right now in chapter 8, when you're going over the axial skeleton, the cranial bones. Cranial bones are classified as flat bones. And so how I describe cranial bones, all right, is basically like a peanut butter sandwich. You have two slices of bread and then the peanut butter's on the inside. Well, that's what your flat bones are like. You've got compact bone that's on the outside, and then in the center of the compact bone, you've got a layer of spongy bone. So you have two layers of compact bone, okay, or the two external layers of compact bone, and then in between, you have your spongy bone. That's the peanut butter, your two external layers of compact bone, that's the bread. And so that's what we're seeing here in this last picture. Okay, so the lamellar bone starts to replace that woven bone. You'll still have these spaces here, and this is the trabeculae, these little kind of passageways here. I shouldn't say passageways, but this bone tissue here. That's the trabeculae. Okay, and then you'll have these spaces in between where the blood vessels will be. Okay, so here's our peanut butter sandwich. Here's the compact bone, another layer of compact bone, and then you've got the trabecular bone, or excuse me, the spongy bone in the middle here. That's our peanut butter. And in case you haven't guessed, I love peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. All right, that is what we call intramembranous ossification. The other type of ossification is a little bit more complex. There's a few more steps involved, is endochondral ossification. Endochondral ossification, all right, we're going to start off with a cartilaginous model, specifically hyaline cartilage. So our skeleton was first produced, and it's made up of cartilage. Now we're going to convert that cartilage from the cartilage connective tissue into bone. And so we're going to see this type of ossification, all right, throughout the majority of your skeleton, all right, upper and lower extremities. Then we'll also see it in the pelvis, all right, in your spine, in the vertebrae there, and on the end portions of your clavicle, which is your collarbone. So we're going to use throughout this example long bone, specifically the humerus. So let's start off with step one. Step one, okay, we're going to have a long bone. The humerus is going to be made up of that fetal hyaline cartilage. So again, this occurs between weeks 8 to 12, and those chondroblasts are responsible for making, all right, that limb, that little humerus there. So we talked about how that occurs through the intramembranous, or excuse me, the interstitial growth and the appositional growth. Okay, so those chondroblasts are doing their thing. They're making the cartilage matrix, and then they get trapped in the matrix, converted into osteocytes, and that's where we rest. So let me show you right here real fast. That's what we see here. Here's step one, real easy, 8 to 12 weeks. Here's your little mini humerus. Okay, that's the bone that makes up the upper portion of your arm. Okay, so the chondroblasts made all this, and then they got stuck here, and they've turned themselves into chondrocytes, and there they hang out. So this whole thing is covered by perichondrium with the cartilage inside. Easy. That leads us to step two. So here's what happens now. Remember what I told you? We don't want calcium involved with our cartilage, because when calcium gets involved with cartilage, it is going to cause calcification of the cartilage. And what does that mean? Well, essentially, it's going to kill the cartilage. So you know how I've said keratin kills? Well, calcium can kill the cartilage because it'll undergo the process of calcification, which is a hardening of the calcium of the cartilage matrix. And when that happens, all right, the chondrocytes will die, which is okay. I mean, it's not good for the cartilage because then the cartilage, all right, will start to degenerate, but it's okay because we're going to replace that cartilage, all right, with bone. And that's what we're going to talk about now. Okay. So in step two, the cartilage starts to calcify. It hardens. And when that happens, we are going to start to see the formation of these holes in the matrix, which isn't a bad thing. It is if it's cartilage. As it starts to harden, these chondrocytes die. And when those areas where they die starts to make these large holes. And we'll see that in the diaphysis or the shaft of our long bone there. And what will happen is now these holes start to form. And so blood vessels are going to migrate and move towards, all right, those areas where there are holes. And so as this occurs, we are going to see now a new type of cell show up. Our osteoblasts start to show up. And what do? Osteoblasts build bone. They secrete the osteoid. And what they do is they secrete the osteoid around that hardened, calcified matrix that was left behind. All right. And as that occurs, now we're going to start to convert that calcified cartilage matrix into bone. And so when we start to see this occur in the diaphysis, we start to see this structure. It's called the periosteal bone collar. And that's going to form around the diaphysis here. I'll show you in a picture. No, a bone spur, that's another great question. A bone spur is not going to have anything to do with calcium. A bone spur is when there's abnormal stresses, okay? It's an overgrowth of bone. And that overgrowth of bone occurs because the stress in that area was increased. So your body does what it normally does is it reacts to that and it'll add bone to that area. For example, you'll see bone spurs on the bottom of your foot near where your plantar fascia covers the bottom of your foot. Very common to see that there. Because the plantar fascia keeps tugging on its attachment site to the bone. And so when it does that, your bone detects that increase in mechanical stress there, and it starts to lay more bone down in that area there. And that bone just keeps growing off. That bone spur keeps growing off of the bone that it's attached to. You'll see bone spurs in the spine too, with people with degeneration of the spine. And again, that situation is there's a change in the biomechanics of the joint, and the bone spur growth occurs because there's an instability in the joint. So what does your body do? It wants to stabilize the joint. And by doing so, it grows bone in the area to make the joint less mobile. And by doing that, when it's less mobile, it increases the stability of the joint. You have one in your knee joint? Yeah. And again, bone spur can be because there's abnormal stresses or biomechanics in the area, and it could occur because of that. I'm sure it doesn't feel very good. All right, so here on our step 2, let me zoom in here. You got it. Come on, my computer doesn't want to work today. All right, so here's step 2. Okay, again, this is occurring when you're still developing inside your mom. All right, so here you can see in the center here, the cartilage here starts to undergo calcification. And so the calcium matrix starts to harden. And by doing so, the cells die. These holes start to develop. And so blood vessels will start to infiltrate this area. And as that occurs, osteoblasts move into this area and they start to lay down osteoid. Okay. And then that osteoid starts to harden. Okay. Because calcium starts the process of calcification and hardening of the bone. And we'll start to get here in the diaphysis, this periosteal bone collar starts to develop. And then we'll start to see, all right, this occur in the epiphysis. Same situation will occur here, okay, in the epiphysis. Starts here in the diaphysis first, okay. While this is going on, this whole area starts to harden. Then the same thing occurs here in the epiphysis, and the same process that happened in the diaphysis is going on. And again, this is all happening inside your mom when you're developing as a fetus. Okay, so we call that area in the diaphysis where we first start to see the ossification there, the primary ossification center. Okay, the primary ossification center. And so as it starts to spread throughout the diaphysis, all right, we'll get this little periosteal bud that's going to extend, all right, from the periosteum into the shaft, all right, of the cartilage there. And so we'll start to spread out our blood vessels, okay, and we'll start to increase the osteoblast presence there as it's starting to secrete its osteoid. Then we'll start to see that breakdown of the calcified cartilage there. So think of the calcified cartilage as kind of like a scaffolding. It's like a template that we're just going to build over. I can't remember. I know there's certain, I don't know if it's bugs or certain animals that will invade other animals' old nests or homes, and they'll pretty much just remodel, all right, the existing structure there to suit them. And that's what happens here. Okay, in our primary ossification center, the shaft starts, or excuse me, the diaphysis starts to undergo that hardening process here. So we'll see a lot of this, all right, by the completion of the 12th week. We'll see that that primary ossification center, the diaphysis in most of your long bones will be bone. And then as that is kind of completing itself, we'll start to see the epiphysis, all right, or the epiphysi, all right, they'll undergo the same scenario, okay? Real easy. Okay, this last statement here, bone connective tissue displaces the calcified degenerating cartilage. What caused the cartilage to degenerate? Calcium. Calcium came in, it calcified or hardened that cartilage matrix, virtually making it impossible for those chondrocytes to get any nutrients, because you can't diffuse very well through the bone matrix, or that hardened, not the bone matrix, but that calcified cartilage matrix, so they die. And so that tissue degenerated, and now we're just going to replace the existing calcified cartilage with bone. Okay, so the secondary ossification centers, hold on, let me go, whoops. That's step 3. This is what we start to see here. Okay. Here's step 3. Now we're starting to get, all right, those secondary ossification centers to begin. And again, all that happens before you're born. Okay, so step 4. We'll see those secondary ossification centers continue to calcify. Cartilage then calcifies and degenerates. And then blood vessels infiltrate. And our osteoprogenitor cells start to jump in there. And what do? Okay, they differentiate into osteoblasts. Okay, and that bone is going to displace the cartilage. Now, at the time of your birth, your skeleton is not completely ossified. Okay, we're still going to see some of these secondary ossification centers, all right, ongoing. So they haven't completely replaced the calcified cartilage with bone tissue yet. It's an ongoing process. So here you can see pretty much the diaphysis is completely ossified. All right, and we're starting to get a lot of the epiphysis on either end. All right, that's undergoing that ossification process. All right, and then you can see here in the metaphysis, we're starting to get some of these growth plate formation is starting to occur here. All right, so this is what you're getting as a baby, a newborn child, bam. Okay, this is what we're seeing in the skeleton of a newborn child here. Okay. Step 5, this process keeps going. All right, now this is going to happen for several years. So rinse and repeat, replace the cartilage with bone, okay, except in 2 spots. The articular cartilage or the hyaline cartilage that covers the epiphysis, because remember, we want to keep that cartilage there, okay, protects the bone, okay, also reduces friction, also acts as a shock absorber, and in the epiphyseal growth plates. All right, that's going to stay there also because we need to lengthen our bone so you can get taller. That's what we're seeing here, and this is going to occur over a number of years. So now you can see our primary ossification center done and complete. Our secondary ossification centers done and complete. So the only cartilage that's remaining is the articular cartilage here, and then our epiphyseal plate here will have our hyaline cartilage here. And so that's going to go for many, many years. All right, because we're going to start, we'll talk about the epiphyseal plate, what's happening there. So that's what we're going to see in that scenario. And then last but not least, step 6, you're done growing. You've reached skeletal maturity. So what we're going to see is at the epiphyseal growth plates, they ossify. They stop producing hyaline cartilage. And then the same thing happens in that area that happened everywhere else. That cartilage calcifies, all right, and then it ossifies. And what's left are the epiphyseal lines. And so this occurs once you've reached your skeletal maturity. And that's what we see in this picture. There's the medullary cavity that's occurred. All right, now we've closed the growth plate. The only area that you'll have cartilage is going to be the articular cartilage that lines the epiphysi, here and here. All right, let me finish up and just quickly talk about bone growth, and then we'll finish up with the review today. Now, just to let you know, obviously I didn't complete Chapter 7. Okay, that's okay, because guess what? I have reviews on my YouTube page for Chapter 7 that will complete the rest of the review. Okay, so if you would like, you can go onto the YouTube page and you can watch that video. And I'll try to look for a link for it. And so when I send out the link for this, I'll try to include that in there for you so you don't have to go hunting around on the YouTube page. You can just click on the email and then just pull it up. Okay, so there'll be a little bit of an overlap between this review and a previous review that I've done, but you should have all that information available for you. Okay, So, because I could go on for another hour talking about this chapter, and I know that I'm going to be losing some of you soon if I haven't already. So let's quickly just go over interstitial growth, and then we'll call it a day. All right, so interstitial growth. Remember, interstitial growth is the lengthening of the bone here. All right, we saw it with the cartilage. We're going to lengthen the internal portion of the cartilage, but here we're going to be discussing what occurs at the epiphyseal plate. So there's 5 zones. 5 zones for the interstitial growth. I'll show you here a picture of it. No, I don't have a picture of it. Shame on me. Okay. Anyways, so zone 1, this is going to be closest to the epiphysis. Okay. This is where we're going to see our chondrocytes, all right, in this area here. All right. So again, we're going to see the tissue there, hyaline cartilage. Okay. The chondrocytes are going to be inside the epiphyseal plate, and they're just chilling out, relaxing. So what we'll see now is those chondrocytes in the second zone here, what we call the proliferating zone. Okay, now those chondrocytes start to divide, where once you have 1 cell, now you have 2 cells. And we know what happens now. Okay, both of those cells, all right, are going to start producing the cartilage matrix and push away from each other. And so as they do that, all right, they're going to push, all right, that zone downwards, and it's going to cause a lengthening of the bone. And so essentially these cells are going to align themselves into these long longitudinal columns. Okay, because there's so many of them. And so now what we'll see is, all right, in the third zone, what we call hypertrophic cartilage. Okay, hypertrophic means we increase the size. We know what hypertrophy means. You're increasing the size of the cells. So they go from a flattened type of configuration. Now the chondrocytes have stopped dividing and they grow up. They get bigger. And we'll see that in the hypertrophic zone, the third zone. So now once they've grown bigger, now they're going to start to die. They're going to start to undergo, all right, calcification. And we saw that, all right, when we were talking about endochondral ossification. Okay, so calcium starts to infiltrate, it starts to harden the cartilage matrix, then that kills off the chondrocytes and they die off. And this leads us into the last zone, the zone of ossification, in which we'll start to see, all right, the lacuna will start to break down, all right, and the chondrocytes have pretty much died off. And so we now have these holes and these spaces are produced. And that allows for capillaries to kind of work their way in and bring in our osteoprogenitor cells, which are going to do their thing, which are going to now give us osteoblasts, which will now produce new bone matrix on top of our old calcified cartilage matrix. We convert that all into new bone. So where we're going to see most of our growth, all right, are going to be in these 2 zones, zone 2 and 3, proliferating zone and then the hypertrophic zone. All right, I think I'm going to end there, okay, for this video. Give you folks a little bit of time to kind of chew on that.